Hello, can everybody hear me? Yes, okay, fantastic. And welcome everybody. Just wait for the panel to sit down. We practiced a lot, but we didn't practice this bit, but that's fine. Okay, hi everybody and welcome. My name's Polly Russell and I'm the curator for the food season here, working with a fantastic team, including Melissa Thompson and Angela Clutton and Joe Allen and an amazing group of British Library staff. It is fantastic. You all brought the sun. Thank you so much today. We're absolutely thrilled and we are really excited for this discussion. Before I talk about that, though, very briefly, I just want to highlight three things. First is to say thank you to our sponsors. Miele, we couldn't do it without you, so thank you very much. The second is to say, if you haven't already, do go to the bookshop and pick up this free guide to British Library food collections, which was written by Ruby Tando and is a just delightful romp through the most amazing food-related collections at the library. And the bookshop are keeping it underneath the counter because there aren't that many, so go and steal one off them. And then the third thing is to say I want to ask you to do something, which is I'd love you all to vote for the British Library Food Awards Food Hero category. That is an award which celebrates somebody in the food industry, the food world in the UK, who's really shaping food culture, the food conversation, the food system for better. And there are nominations for amazing cheesemaker, a woman who's working to improve food for older people, amazing community food leaders. There are 8 on the short list. You all can vote and they will be awarded on the 9th of June. So there should be a QR code coming up at some point, and you can go onto the Food Season Food Awards page and vote. Okay, that's the end of my announcements for the food season, and it's my great pleasure and delight to be welcoming you all to this event on food and spectacle. I've been thinking about this event for a long time. I've wanted to do something like this for ages, but hadn't quite found the perfect panel, the perfect chair, but we have absolutely now. We've got the most wonderful Dr. Eleanor Janega, who is going to be chairing. She is a medieval historian. She's originally from Seattle, but she came to the UK to do her MA and PhD, and we're lucky enough to have kept her. She has the most fantastic blog and podcast called Going Medieval, and she's the author of The One and Future Sex, Going Medieval on Women's Roles in Society. That is on sale in the bookshop, as are all the books by all of this panel, so do go and buy those.
Stop your flow. I've reached the right pressure for popcorn. Who has popcorn?
Amazing. Okay, this is real spectacle.
Okay,
we're working with timings. Go ahead.
Well, this is also the first time I've done it, so there's a bit of mild jeopardy. This is a cereal puffing gum. It's how all cereal used to be made, and we're going to try and make some for you now. So, still some learnings. Thank you very, very much. That was pretty exciting. And there'll be popcorn coming out for everyone right now. It is all cereal puff. It's explosion-flavoured popcorn as well, so you get a bit of smoke. I've got to say, right from the top, I wanted to thank the amazing team from the British Library to getting through the most amazing health and safety. I think we all walked past a sign that said no to food and drink in the auditorium. We've got food and drink in the auditorium. We've also gone far further than that as well. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Brilliant. Sam will do anything to shut me up. But I am about to finish, except to say, as you've just experienced, this event is about spectacle. There will be spectacle. We're working with precarious timings and lots of jeopardy. So it's going to be a ride. It's going to be great fun, brilliant discussion. I'm handing over to Eleanor now. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I hate to try to take away from popcorn. I'm not going to win this battle. I understand that. But I am really excited today to be here, mostly because I love popcorn. But other than that, we have some really exciting speakers today that I'm going to try to keep up with. And we are very excitingly going to run the gamut from the extremely contemporary all the way back to the best 1,000 years of history, the medieval period. But what I think is really going to come out of this conversation, what I'm really looking forward to, is I think what we're going to get down to essentially is that human beings, A, want to eat food, and B, we love a little surprise, don't we? and there is something in the way that our society has constructed itself that we both really yearn for the presentation of food as an experience. It's not just something that we find, for example, in the medieval period when we are talking about stuffed peacocks. We're doing it now with molecular gastronomy. And so this really speaks to something in our society that I think is inherently human. And we're going to just kick off by going right back to the medieval period with Calum Coburn. Coburn or Cockburn?
Coburn.
Coburn. I know how to be British. I can say Coburn. But we're going to start right in the medieval period and get our minds going.
Yeah, so I have the pleasure to kick off with the medieval feast. Now, I think the phrase that comes to mind when we think of the medieval feast, certainly in the manuscript illuminations that you see on the screen, is sensual, sensory splendor. It would have been an extraordinary event to attend. It was a public occasion. It was an event that was hosted by the nobility, by aristocracy, by royalty, and it would have been an explosion of sight, sound, visual splendor. Starting from the moment you would enter into the banqueting hall. The kind of most famous coronation feasts of someone like Richard II was hosted in Westminster Hall, which, as you probably know, is a gigantic space. It would have been filled with people. Certain feasting accounts that survive to us mention as much as 200, 250 people all in one room. And the hall would have been covered in tables, with a high table at the top for your most important guests. And it would have been a world in which there was a lot of colour. People often kind of slightly do down the medieval period and think of it as in terms of being something quite grey and sombre. Certainly that's the vision that we see on TV adaptations. But actually they loved colour, and it would have been incredibly gaudy, flamboyant. There probably would have been wall hangings and tapestries all over the walls. There would have been people in fineries, really colourful clothes. There would have been lots of light, torches all about the walls, and plate that were just carrying the food in and shining, reflecting that light too. And you probably also would have heard a lot of noise from musicians and players, singers, jongleurs, dancers. There's records of one particular character, a woman called Matilda Makejoy, who is an amazing woman and apparently did make a lot of people joyful. She was a dancer, a saltatrice, which is an acrobat dancer, and she was employed multiple times at feasts for Edward III, though not employed as a permanent member of the household. So the kind of medieval feast is a huge event. It's something that's done to celebrate an important occasion, an anniversary, a coronation, a diplomatic embassy from abroad, and there was a lot of intent and meaning behind it, and there was an awful lot of preparation and money that went into it too. I wanted to show some examples of medieval cooking items from the British Library's collections and start with this quite scrappy document, but which has a special place in my heart. So this is a household roll. It contains a dietary account, and essentially it's a financial record. It relates to one woman, a woman called Catherine de Norwich, who was a noble woman. She was twice widowed, and she had a number of manorial estates and holdings in Norfolk and Suffolk. And this diet account is for the year 1336 to 1337, and it relates to all of the expenses that she accrued feeding her household. And we know from this account that she held 3 feasts in that year, one for the feast day of St. Catherine, who was her namesake, another for Advent, so the Christmas period, and then the third one was an anniversary, the anniversary of the death of her second husband, Walter. And for this feast, She hosts 90 people. She spends an absolute fortune of £10 and 18 shillings, which in modern day terms is around £10,000 on this one feast. And she has literally everything. She has 1,200 eggs, 20 different types of game bird, and over 250 birds in total, hundreds of loaves of bread. She has oysters because that's her favorite, gingerbread, which she had specifically prepared for the Christmas period. And what's fascinating about it as a role, the fact that it's just a huge amount of money and variety of produce that's included here, but also that that all of the products that are listed actually come from her manorial holdings. So she is directing all of this resource using her own money, her own wealth. So in many ways, the feast is almost like this extension of her being. It's like the best possible advertisement for her. Moving on, I wanted to show another role, and this is probably the most important food item in the collection, though Polly might correct me. And it's a roll that contains a collection of culinary recipes called The Form of Curry. It's one of the earliest discrete collections that we have, and it was apparently made by the master cook of Richard II's household. And he was in charge of a staff of over 300 people who were cooking for over 1,000 people most days. And he begins with this sort of opening preamble where he talks about what he's going to tell you, teach you how to cook. And it's a mixture of high and low dishes, from potages and soups and pies to roasted meats, pastries and subtleties, which is something I'm going to get onto later. But one of the interesting things about this roll and the recipes is that there's not that much way in terms of instruction. You know, we don't have measurements or quantities, and it's absolutely fiendish to try and recreate them, as I have failed at multiple times. But there's lots of instruction relating to the appearance of things, the visual quality of things, the color of things, the design of things. One notable recipe is for chastelettes, which is literally pastry castles. And I've included an example of what might be a pastry castle. I'm not entirely sure. And essentially it instructs you to roll out pastry and fashion 4 open-topped coffin pies, fill them with different mixtures, savory and sweet, some like cured pork or combinations of apples and pears, and then to fashion ramparts and battlements to place around the rims of these coffins. And the actual mixtures would have been coloured, like lurid colours. The apple and pear mixture uses a pigment, a really lurid green pigment, so it would have been really eye-catching for everyone. And this kind of recipe falls into a very specific type of medieval food that emerges in the sort of 14th and 15th centuries, and that's something called a subtlety. Subtleties were elaborate, illusionary dishes that probably would have been served tableside. On the continent, they're also known as entremet, which has another meaning in a modern food context, but at the time literally meant between the courses. So as one course ended, this gigantic platter, pastry creation would have been brought into the hall. And they range from the designs range from sort of exotic animals, lions, bears, that sort of thing in the early period, up to much more elaborate creations by the end that have a lot of meaning and input and are iconographically really complicated. So I've included another manuscript here that's in our collections, which is called a Book of Cookery. And it's another recipe collection, but it notably has these 2 bills of fare for real feasts at the beginning, one for Richard II's banquet and another for the appointment of John Stafford as Archbishop of Canterbury. And he has 3 subtleties, which are, and we have actual descriptions of them here, and they're all religious subjects. So the first is like St. Andrew, and it has Stafford in full pontifical robes kneeling before St. Andrew on an altar. Another one has the representation of the Trinity with monks and priors and abbots all around him. And the third one, the most bizarre, is God with the Holy Ghost in a sun, and then Thomas Becket kneeling before him with a sword in his head. Because that's what everybody wants from a medieval feast. Of course, for Stafford and his audience, it would have made perfect sense because Becket is the most famous Archbishop of Canterbury, and his martyrdom was a recognizable image that everybody would have known by the 15th century. So that's this manuscript. I wanted to end with subtleties sort of at the kind of the apex, the end of the medieval period, and this particular banquet is thrown for Henry VI. So Henry VI is the infant son of Henry V of Agincourt fame, and his father Henry dies young, and Henry has to ascend the throne as basically a 9-year-old, and he can only rule with a council of regents. At his coronation feast, there were subtleties between the dishes like Stafford's, but he also had a poet that he commissioned to write specific verses that told you exactly what was going on in the subtleties. And these subtleties had very much a political message. They are all connected to Henry's claim to the thrones of both England and France. So they had patron saints of England and France kneeling before Henry as an infant. They had a representation of the Emperor Sigismund and Henry V as 2 military leaders, and Henry is continuing their might. And then the final one is St. George killing the dragon, which, again, another image that would have been very recognizable to a lot of people and appears in lots of illuminated manuscripts from this period. So that's what I wanted to show today, that you have the full gamut of splendor and performance and spectacle going on in the medieval feast, some fun and also some political intent there as well.
I'm just going to call that a not-so-subtlety. That's all. That's what's going on. Also, personal medievalist beef. I swear to God, if you bring something with the Emperor Sigismund in front of me, I'm going to kick off. But that's Hussite beef, everybody. My vendetta against the Emperor Sigismund on behalf of the Hussites. Yeah, no, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's fine. This is, I think, incredible because it just shows us how medieval people are, in fact, weird little guys in these ways that are strange and mysterious to us. But there are these things that are incredibly modern within it. So, for example, if within a pie you cut it open and it's lurid green, yes, that could be incredibly medieval, but it also could be like 1965.
Yeah.
And so there is something within us that longs for this, but we're going to have to come back to it because we must keep going, and we have to keep all these things in mind so that we can have a nice conversation at the end. But I'm going to try to go, it is me next, but I'm going to keep it rolling with the late medieval period. And I think Calum is, of course, exactly bang on here in terms of what it is that medieval people are doing at feasts. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about a little bit in terms of what medieval people are doing at feasts is having recipes that are inedible. Calling these things recipes and including them in cookery books and things of this nature because the display and the splendor and the spectacle is much more important to them than the actual food matter. Yes, you're going to need to have things that you eat, but also, are you having a fancy party if there isn't a peacock on the table? That is a huge question. Or in terms of the feast that you were talking about earlier, multiple boar's heads. And I always like to bring this up because one of my favorite ever medieval recipes is for a feast. And what you do is you get a chicken drunk. And you get the chicken so drunk that it passes out. and then you pluck all of its feathers, and you paint it to look as though it is roasted. And then you bring it out onto the table, and then when someone goes to cut it, it will wake up from its drunken stupor and start running around, and everyone will be like, oh, haha, that naked chicken is alive. And then the chicken will then be beheaded in front of everyone, and they'll all go, oh, great, I love to see chickens getting murdered. And then the chicken will be taken back into the kitchens. The chicken will then be disemboweled, stuffed so that it has mercury inside of it, and actually roasted. Then you will bring it back out onto the table, show everyone the chicken, and as you cut into it this time, the fumes from the mercury escaping will make a kind of walk, walk, walk sound, so it's like the chicken is alive again. And that's a delicious recipe for a feast. And no one is eating this chicken. I can't stress enough that it's like this isn't something that anyone puts in their mouth, but it is in cookery books. This spectacle is something that you would be expected to bring out as a part of a feast. And so this is an imaginary feast. This comes to us from the book of the works of Alexander the Great, which is a 15th century manuscript. And, I think that this is an important point, though, because as we're going to see time and again from our talks, when we are imagining great feasts, when we imagine the past, we want this display. There is something in us, I think, socially, that makes us desire to see something like a roast peacock on a table. And so we imagine these things into the past constantly, and medieval people are doing that as well. But that isn't to say that ideas of display don't move on. So this is a really lovely still life from the 17th century that is kind of showing how things do move on, because what we have here is a very 17th century idea of what abundance and display and food is. And it's much more food heavy. Certainly. We've got lobsters, we have lemons, exotic, ooh. But one of the big holdovers, look at this beautiful pie. I hope you're ready to talk a lot about pies. I am. But it's still using this incredible pastry formwork. It's got the little kind of crown on top of it, but you also have beautiful haunches of meat, wonderful and delicate things like grapes. But then also there are all these elements of display as well, with like a macaw, a monkey, a dog. So these are things that continue to really inhabit the imagination. It's not enough in the 17th century just to have incredible exoticisms. You still have to have these little touches of display. So here we have kind of some absent musicians. So as Calum was saying, in a medieval feast, you're going to expect that musicians are going to be there. Artistically, we still want to show, well, at a great feast, there's going to be sound, there's going to be music. But here we have a particular artistic endeavor that's completely devoid of people. So the medieval one, we have the serving people bringing in the peacock. There is this understanding that one of the things that is going to make a feast happen are these teams of 300 people who are working constantly in a kitchen. Here, in the early modern world, humans are conspicuously absent. And instead you have these delights from around the globe as our ideals kind of begin to open up. And we want all of these exotic things, but we don't necessarily want to think about where they've come from, can't think of why. We wouldn't want to think about where the exotic things have come from, and humans being involved in that. Then when we get into the Victorian period, we have incredibly modern sensibilities that are a lot to do with these burgeoning technical ideas and these ideas of scientific ways of making things happen. This is a really, really incredible plate that is called Various Desserts, and it's from Beaton's Everyday Cookery and Housekeeping. Because when I think everyday cookery, this is what I'm doing. But very much here, one of the things that I think is important is, of course, we have the Christmas plum pudding right in the middle. And this is something that we still do on a micro level. We are all expecting a plum pudding at Christmas, certainly. And, I'm lighting mine on fire, absolutely. But we do sort of expect a kind of coup de grace, right? Whenever you're having a big party. There are tiered cakes at a wedding. Oh, I can bring out my party trick. Did you know that tiered cakes at a wedding are based on the spire of St. Bride's that Wren built? And so it's actually a play on St. Bride's Church. And now every time you have a tourist, if you walk them by St. Bride's, you can say, wedding cakes are actually tiered because of that, and not the other way around. So that's a fun fact. But this is the sort of thing that we would be doing at the time. In an early modern standpoint, oh, you need a big wedding cake for the middle? Look, we've got a pun on the local church. Isn't that incredible? You know, mixed fruits that are being brought out in this way. You know, now we might think that's a little bit desultory in terms of a dessert. But if you've got a lot of soft fruits at the time, that's rather a lot. I am desperate for the chantilly basket myself. I want that, you know, terribly. And I think also these are things that kind of really resonate from us on a fictional level. So, for example, my childhood fairy tales and things like that, there was always a blamage, wasn't there? And, you know, there's like, I love the ice pudding and the lemon jelly in here. And, you know, if you asked a childhood me to kind of like, if I could draw, to draw a picture of a fancy party or something, I would put a blancmange in there. I don't think I've ever actually had a sweet blancmange. But, you know, if I was going to make a movie that had an overladen party, I would certainly have that. And in the Victorian period, then we have this rise in technical ability and also new things like gelatins and like blancmanges that really sort of take off. Although medieval people are bad for a blancmange too. They simply love a ground almond. Yeah, it's certainly true. But this kind of comes over to the fantastical in ideas, because if we are wanting a kind of display in our heads, and this is something that is constantly happening, so too do they function as a warning within fiction, and this is something that I'm quite interested in. And this inhabits mythologies, fairy tales, and modern movies. So, you know, I'm thinking in these cases, you know, Persephone is doomed to be in the underworld half the year because she eats the pomegranate seeds. Eustace has the Turkish delight in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and that's why he's taken over by the White Witch. And here, this is from Pan's Labyrinth, which you must see if you have not. But here we have this fantastic feast that is laid out for Ophelia, our heroine, and the terrible monster, the Pale Man there. And she's just got to walk past this feast, obtain the object of her desire, and walk out again. And she can't do it, and she takes a grape off the table, which wakes up the very scary monster, and it chases her, and it's horrifying and wonderful and fantastic. But this really kind of gets to this sense of what these feasts can also do. When we are having food at this level and spectacle at this level, it is sort of hitting these buttons in our brain that we can't resist them. And we're also kind of frightened of that. You know, the fact that we can be overloaded with spectacle. If you give us enough pomp, it's very difficult for us to hold ourselves back. And so what does that mean for us? And what it means still is that we are kind of doing these things. So I don't know how many weddings you have been to that have a chocolate fountain, but I've been to at least 3. And I'm not mad about that. I want to make it clear. It's absolutely fine. You know, you haven't lived until you've seen a German count with chocolate all down his front. But it is one of these things where we are still kind of inventing these things that have this incredible technical ability, but this opulence, this over-the-topness that you get from something as simple as chocolate, because, you know, you could just have a bar of chocolate, couldn't you? But then that wouldn't be very wedding-y of us, would it? And this does also do that kind of danger thing, because, again, I have seen German counts with chocolate all down their fronts, right? So there is this almost, if you give in to the spectacle of something, you are sort of opening yourself up for gluttony or ruination of your outfit, right? Which is certainly there. And then also, my last great image, there is this also concern about what that can mean for us in an over-the-top way within fiction. And so here, this is from Spirited Away, and I couldn't decide if I wanted to show the wonderful food that sends family into pigs, or if I wanted to show the aftermaths of this feast. But in both cases, what we're presented with is the idea of an excess of food turning us into the worst possible things, and also the possibility that an excess of food, an excess of technicalities, can mean that we are never satisfied. So if one is presented with the most fabulous food in the world, then what does that mean in terms of our own moral culpabilities, and can we ever be stopped? And that creates these situations like this with the No-Face, who he is completely bottomless, and actually what he wants is sort of human connection, which he's seeking through food. Beautiful moral tales, we love to see them. But these are still very potent images for us because of our historic understanding of food as a form of spectacle and our desire to see this kind of pushed forward. So one can easily think of the medieval period or certainly the Victorian period, but these are still things that we want deeply. And I think that we aren't necessarily comfortable with what that means yet. And so more on that later, because I'm really excited to get to our second Calum of the panel, because we...
Of five Calums.
Yeah, five Calums. Everyone else is a Calum other than me. But because Calum is going to be able to talk to us a bit about the practicalities of actually doing all of this. It's nice for us to wax rhapsodic about how I want a little pie in the shape of a castle, but some of us are actually out here making the pies in the shapes of castles and making the world a better place.
Yeah, so just to give a little bit of background as to sort of how I got into that, I opened a restaurant in 2014 called Holborn Dining Room, and there we sort of were focusing on lots of pie-related things, and I sort of threw myself into the history of pie making and Victorian pie making, and this was all in a period of time, I feel, where especially social media was very focused on hyper sort of colourful things, very beautiful looking things. What I was doing was brown cooking, I thought, right? And actually didn't really think anybody would be very interested in it. But it's my nature to do that sort of thing. I like constructed cooking. And as my wife said, you should put this on social media. And I didn't know at the time. I had an Instagram account that I'd opened. I had one picture of my ex-girlfriend. So I quickly deleted that and started to put pictures of these sort of large ornate pies on social media. And it just blew up. And it taught me very quickly that absolutely, you know, the spectacle of food is still desired. And then what I wanted to do, which I did with working with Polly here at the library a little bit, was to look at these old recipes, look at Kidder's recipes of Victorian England, and to take these sort of ornate pies, which, like we've talked about already, sometimes weren't entirely edible, right? The pastry would be made, you know, 50% salt, 50% flour. So it had this incredible structure to it. You could build these very elaborate pies, but you couldn't eat it. And what I wanted to do was take my modern knowledge of cooking and apply that to these techniques and to make food edible, but still look the same. So that has been an interesting journey. And, you know, I've gone from... I was just reminded of one a minute ago when you talked about the lurid colours inside pies. So that's another thing I try not to do, is never use food colouring. We try to use, you know, the ingredients themselves, whether that's reducing down a whole bag of carrots that's been juiced to make a very bright syrup, but it's natural. And I made one pie for an event where, depending on where you slice the pie, I told them it was a clock, right? Told these guests this is a clock. I think I called it Pâté Philippe, after it was a French pâté croûte, right?
Boom.
And I said, you know, we're going to cut this, and inside is a clock, and it's going to sort of start the time off. And inside was a sausage that when you sliced inside the pie, it had the time. And I knew where I sliced it that the time was different to the actual time of the night. And everyone was disappointed. And I said, sometimes you need to shake these things. And sliced it, and it was the correct time. And it's the magical moment that I know people still look for nowadays.
Yeah.
Right, so it's applying those old techniques. So that was done in that Victorian period in France as well. So, but again, they used to use a dye, and they'd paint the hands on. So we worked out how to do it another way. And I still see it nowadays. You know, we do dinners where we do beef Wellingtons for 100, 150 people. Right. And we march them through the room before the beef Wellington. And that's something that would have been done 100 years ago, 200 years ago. The only difference now is you know, you can register people's love of the spectacle based on likes on social media. You have this direct metric of that want and need for it. So... yeah, it's been a sort of incredible journey with pie making, and it's taken me around the world. So it's not just a British thing. That sort of, you know, we do that all over. And we talk about weddings as well. It's the same thing. You know, I get requests all the time. Can you build wedding pies. So we'll do 6 or 7 tiered wedding pies that have got, 5 or 6 different bird games and game birds inside and different fillings. That's my world. It's my weird little world.
I don't even really know what to say to that. I mean, it's an incredible thing because I do think there is this tendency, especially when we are in the British milieu, to think that the pie that's ours. Although, with all due respect to the Aussies who are doing a great game of pies, it absolutely has to be said. But there is this tendency for us to think, well, maybe this is just us, being odd. But I do think it is interesting that you can have these metrics out in this social media world that is looking at this. And it's kind of interesting because it's somewhere between this spectacle of the medieval, I think, where if you have like these lurid or very pretty things, one is always seeing something very pretty on social media, aren't they? Being able to kind of sell the concept of brown food, I love, because actually probably brown food is more tasty a lot of the time. I'm a sucker for brown food.
But do you know what? Something that really influenced my thinking on spectacle of food was I started to get annoyed with social media because I realised people were creating things sometimes just for the wow factor, which again weren't edible. I could see it and I was like, oh, going the wrong way. And actually, I lost a lot of sleep over about 2 years about this. My wife thought we were in financial trouble. And I said, actually, no, I'm thinking about a specific pie. So it's still an ongoing project, but I don't know if anyone knows the pie room in Holborn. It's something that we opened, and there I kind of came up with, we had a regular customer, used to come every day, 5 days a week, French, bought pork pies 5 days a week. And one day I said to him, what do you do for a living? And he said, I have a 3D tech company around the corner. And I said, we should maybe do something together, because I like that mixing technology with history. And in my head, I thought I could, with this guy, we can print food-safe plastics, right? So I wanted to build something which represents the turn against people just creating things for the internet. So with him, we printed a 3D pyramid mold with a stand to build a pie inside that shows the different layers of pie-making history when you cut into it. And inside of that, inside the actual pyramid, there is a chamber which has an even more ornate pie in. So this is an ongoing project. So you're all, now I've committed to it by telling you all. That was my way of just kind of saying, like, actually it's not, which is just, it's not the outside necessarily that counts. Wait until you see the inside of this thing.
I want to see
Sorry,
the
I'm so
inside.
weird.
I want to see I want to see the inside of the pie. That's all. I'm just kind of now I'm going to be thinking about the pie at night. And okay, that's great. We need to keep going because I'm scribbling my notes, and also we have some more delightful Victoriana coming our way, courtesy. Well, Ian, it's your turn, yes?
It is apparently my turn.
Hi there.
Okay.
And also, what I think is really important here in terms of the practical aspects, it's not just historians. It's people who make things, but it's also people who are still making art and who are relating to food in that way. So.
Well, thank you. I should explain a little bit about that and maybe try and draw some of those themes together. My name is Ian Kelly. I'm a historian, biographer, but also a dramatist, a playwright and screenwriter. With a long-standing fascination with food and its kind of theatrical and storytelling possibilities, which is why Sam and I know each other of old, variously, parties and jelly and story and whatever. And I suppose the question to throw out there in the middle of it all is, what brought you here on this beautiful day? What aspect of spectacle or food or books, or the idea of the story around all of that actually was the thing that inspired you to be here? Because I suspect it's something really quite old-fashioned in our brains that actually allows us this access sometimes to stories and moments via food. And Antonin Carême, the first celebrity chef, so-called, had a wonderful turn of phrase that children will enjoy food if it has a story attached, even a sad one. And which struck me as pertinent for today. So before I blither on more about where this story came from, because you may or may not be aware that my massive TV series, horribly exposing my erotic imagination to you now and a global audience, is sort of halfway through on Apple TV at the moment. Carême is called, and I think first of all I'll show you a trailer by way of some food spectacle. Do I have to click this forward to do that?
I think you do, yes.
I think I do. Or no, it just goes.
Yeah, look at that.
La nourriture, c'est ce qui fait un pays. Comme sa langue, son art. C'est le premier que nous connaissons. La nourriture peut parfois être plus éloquente que les mots.
Il est aussi bon en lit qu'en cuisine.
Travaillez pour moi. Vous serez le chef pâtissier de la France. C'est là que vous allez m'aider pour quelque chose de délicat, dangereux et tenu secret. Ne me décevez pas.
Le cuisinier, l'espion. Carême.
Bon appétit.
There you go.
Very good.
And that is the regular working life of the people in the food industry, as I'm sure you're all aware. Calum is a story that began here, which is why it's a great pleasure and joy to be here. In the rare books collection here at the British Library, and the extraordinary illustrated books that Calum wrote and illustrated himself. This is a detail from one of, actually this is from the collection in the Bibliothèque Nationale, but they have very similar here in the British Library. They kind of fold out and out. These images of food spectacle. And in brief, this is sort of how it began. I sometimes tell the story of just how much I love this period in the 18th century, tropes of the birth of now out of, 18th century London and Paris and so on. But, actually it was food. Many of you will know the Brighton Pavilion, which I'll talk about in a second or two. And when you go around the Brighton Pavilion, you go to the kitchens there, the remaining bit of the kitchen, the guides always say, this is where the great Carême cooked. And invented caramel, they used to say, which sadly is not true, but is a wonderful way to remember how to pronounce his name. Anyway, a little while after that, though, I was going through France, and past Chateau Valençay in the Loire. I have a particular love of Valençay cheese, which is that sort of pyramidal one with ash on. Anyway, I stopped just because of that. But when you go around the chateau and you go to the kitchens, the guides will say, this is where the great Carême cooked. And this is a bit of a story. But a little while after that, I was in Russia filming something else, and at Peterhof and Pavlovsk, the Romanov palaces outside St. Petersburg, the Russian guides, if they take you to the kitchens, say, this is where the great Carême cooked and learned to cook like a Russian, they like to say, which is also not true. But you gotta think, okay, this is a story, but really what did it for me was coming here to the British Library thinking I'd find out more about him, that maybe there was a drama or a story here. And there wasn't anything in English at all really. There was no modern biography, but there were his cookbooks, his extraordinary illustrated cookbooks, which are recipes that come with memoir et souvenir, his little anecdotes along the way. So I wanted to just fling in that idea, I suppose, that one of the issues in the progress, actually, of food and spectacle and theatre is the extent to which a cookbook is a drama and a spectacle in and of itself that actually allows us access to the idea of the extraordinary food craft that might be being enjoyed in the households of the rich and famous. It's Calum himself in his second cookbook who coins the phrase, "You can try this yourself at home," which obviously is rather ludicrous, you might have thought, when dealing with giant spun sugar ruins of Antioch there. And indeed, what he terms, on the far side on the right there, a Welsh hermitage. This a man who had never been to Wales, but obviously, but was cooking for the prince of it at the time. But anyway, a great, a fantasist in food and in spun sugar and so on. But although Calum, in brief, has an extraordinary importance in the history of food, the first chef to become rich and famous publishing cookbooks, in a sense, the first celebrity chef, the first person to sort of promulgate the idea of sort of glamour and royal food to a new, hungry, nascent middle class for sort of how to cook and what food might be, and all those arguments of the early 19th century of what food really is, what luxury might be. Do we eat to live and live to eat, or all of that. And although he is the man who invents the chef's hat and first person to publish recipes for meringue and souffle and vol au vent and all of this, what I was very taken with was his ability to put out there the idea that actually food is an extraordinary art form that everybody can have a relationship with, irrespective of whether they're properly eating this stuff. And that idea was really what garnered him kind of Olympian fame. But I'll take you to just some of the spectacle illustrations. These, again, sort of fold out and out from his cookbooks, like maps, old-fashioned, maps out of guidebooks, for those of you old enough to remember those sorts of things. Before Google Maps, we had those. And but the ones here, it should be said, in the collection of the rare books, rather wonderfully, are slightly spotted with grease stains in the way of cookbooks that have actually been used, which I love about them. But very often with these table designs as well, of ways you might decorate your table, and so on. So, we have, with Calum, this extraordinary kind of close detail of the potential drama around food. The people, because as alluded to in our 8 hours of epic television, and we've only got a third of the way through the book, by the way, there's hope of season 2, we have all these amazing characters because he cooks for Napoleon and Josephine and Napoleon and Marie-Louise Habsburg, and for Talleyrand, and then for the Prince Regent, and the Tsar of Russia, and the first French Rothschilds, and the whole thing is just, name drop soup. It is just dripping with all those glamorous associations. But actually, it is constantly about the theatre of it. And I thought, really inspired very much by Sam and his jellies, I needed to talk about the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, the most fantastical and preposterous palace in the world, made to look something between the Taj Mahal and indeed a jelly, but sort of a confection of a building in and of itself. But Calum arrives to cook for the Prince Regent just as the palace is being changed from the old Henry Holland designs to these new fantastical Nash designs, and it is for and with Calum that the kitchens are opened. So he has some input into all of this, and again, linking back to some of what Eleanor and the Calums were saying earlier, very often, food is about technology as well, the new world that is, brought to bear on food by what can be done. And Calum ends up cooking in what then was definitively the most technologically advanced kitchen in the world, at this palace that we should remind ourselves was actually built for the twin purposes, and they're very linked ideas in feasting and spectacle, the twin ideas of kind of music and food. that one half of the palace is a music room, and the other great temple on the other side is the dining room, and then the kitchen's right next door to it, which was considered architecturally radical, dangerous, bizarre, because kitchens were usually put right away for purposes of fire risk issues, but also just the smell of it all. But this kitchen was, arguably one of the first times when that close proximity of the one to the other was possible, which is why I love this kind of cross-section you get, which is actually Nash's own aqua tints that are owned by the pavilion to this day. And you get this, close proximity of the one to the other, and then this kitchen with a steam-heated table in the middle, and we have an image, of Calum himself, allegedly, cooking in the kitchens there. But you get an idea of the extraordinary nature of what it was to cook for the Prince Regent and in this palace, and with this amazing technology around you. The batterie de cuisine there was asset stripped by Queen Victoria when she sold the palace to Brighton Town Council, and is still in use allegedly to this day in Buckingham Palace. But there we go. A lot of the rest of it has sadly disappeared. And again, in terms of just the drama of it all and that thought, I suppose, for an occasion like today, I wanted to say, I'm always taken with that issue within recreating food and the sort of dramas we're trying to tell in the television series as well, because every episode has a kind of food challenge, a food spectacle issue, a food thing. My book was a biography with recipes, where every chapter you get a recipe pertinent to the moment of. You can, tell stories with and around food, but this is the great missing item in the remaining dining rooms of this era, and that issue of rarely do we ever now expect our food to be competing with this sort of elaborate over-display of dining room. But they absolutely did. Out of the other signal event, really, of Calum's career, which is the move from service à la française, sort of presentational banqueting, as you might call it, a buffet style, to a new style, service à la russe, of plating in courses. He was a bit of a poet of the kitchen, and he used to say, we moved from one great drama to a series of little acts. And it's that thing that, of course, is our expectation largely today, but not if you hang around with Sam Bompas, where you actually get to have sort of, a major event altogether. But anyway, so that's some of the origins of it all. In brief, I just wanted to, happily mark this moment, because there's a new edition of the book just come out to come with the TV series. That this is actually where it all began, right here, and the collection of his cookbooks in this building that led on to all the fabulous stories you can tell and enjoy with food. So to give you something a bit more yummy and a brief little anecdote, this is the classic of the French patisserie to this day, the choux pastry swan. Created by Calum for the Empress Josephine. Napoleon chose the bee as his emblem, Josephine chose the swan, and there it is, with stuffed with chantilly cream. And I'll end just with this, it's a rather lovely little story. It's one of the few times that Calum credits another chef. Chantilly cream was created by Vatel, and Vatel, a chef of a previous era, famous otherwise, really, only for committing suicide in the hot panic of a royal banquet for the king. The fish didn't arrive in time, and he threw himself on his sword. So distraught was he. But sadly, the fish then arrived, but it was too late. Vatel was dying, which gives us the birth of the myth of the tempestuous chef in the kitchen. Calum, though, a patissier and a confectioner before he was a chef, rather in the spirit of Heston Blumenthal and Ferran Adrià and these great chefs who have come out of that craft, said, yes, Vatel. He did lose his head somewhat, didn't he? So there we go. And I'll stop on that for the time being, on the mad and fabulous world of Calum. But if you haven't checked it out yet on Apple TV, I think you're the sort of audience we've been trying to reach out to. Thank you. That's about it. That's it for now.
Yeah, well, Sam, no pressure. Please don't kill yourself. But cool. In terms of, we're going to turn now to some practicalities of spectacle, because that's your bag, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. Do I have any slides?
Do you?
maybe? I don't know, maybe let's see.
Like, girl, I don't know. Like,
I might do. No, it looks like I don't. Anyway, okay. Are we wrapping at 3:30, by the way?
we are going until 1:45.
Oh, okay, cool.
Because we're fancy. Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. So I was going to be very, very quick. In actual fact, I'll be just quick. It's very, very good to be here, not least for the fact that Ian's book, Carême, was one of the things that made me really excited about food 18 years ago. In the last 18 years, I've really focused on trying to bring food spectacle to life. So I'm Sam Bompas. I lead a company called Bompas Parr, and I sort of think of myself as, I made up a word. It's called a culinographer. It doesn't really mean anything, but it sort of encapsulates the gamut of the sorts of things that we do. And over the years, I've variously made a 50-ton jelly. I've cooked with lava to a restaurant where we heat up the rock, pour it out, cook on it. It's very hot. It cooks very, very quickly. You can see that I like bringing maybe an element of sort of danger and intensity into the what we're doing as well. Makes me feel really alive. Still got all our bits so far. But I was also pleased as well because while we're talking about food and spectacle, there's actually been quite a lot of British glory with this, despite the brilliant history of other cuisines. And it's been said as well that the French really dominated Western cuisine over the last 5 centuries. But there were 2 sort of dishes which the Brits are really good at, and one of them is Calum's pies and the realms of roasting. And the other, happily, is jelly, and we really cut our teeth making jelly. So seeing all of those beaten jellies was I was sending shivers down my spine. The riband jelly, it's got things on the diagonal. That's really hard to do. It's mesmerising. You normally have to have a complex 2-part mould with, I think there's a mould called the Devonshire mould, where you screw these spirals into the original set of the jelly. And then you unmold the first one, and then you pour cream, so your blancmanges, into the interstices of the dessert. And when you unmold it, no one can fathom how you've made a dish quite like that. It's really, really special. But what I thought I'd do is, rather than talking about some of the things, it's just doing things, and then you can judge for yourself. So the first thing we did was the popcorn. Next up, I've got a really simple thing. I really like when you take almost any ingredient, there's something really wonderful about it if you research it enough, and you can find something delightful with it. A lot of our work is working with brands like Guinness or the Unilever family, and they're brands that you might recognize every day, and then we're trying to take this thing and discover what are things that people haven't seen about it when perhaps there's been lots of enterprise with it. And a really good way to give an example of that is the pickle. So I talked about this in terms of magnificence in the mundane. Just even a humble pickle, there can be a lot more. There's nothing humble about it. Even within the mighty pickle, there can be a lot more to it. So basically found out that a small gherkin draws about 300 watts of power, and a large gherkin draws about 500 watts of power if you plug it into the wall. And what I immediately thought about doing was then making a massive gherkin chandelier. And doing this gherkin chandelier, it's a monstrosity of wires. It's unbelievably dangerous. It draws two lots of 3-phase power. So that's when you see those power cables like this. If you touch it, that's more than twice. It's about as much power as to power a city block or 2 electric chairs. So it's monstrously dangerous. So we haven't brought that today, but what I have brought, is a tiny, modest version of it, which we call the Gherkinator. And we're gonna plug it in here. And what's happening is when you put electricity into a gherkin, then you're exciting the sodium ions and the salt. And as they fall back to a ground state from the high energy, they emit a sort of light called sodium D-line. And so that's the same light that you see in parking lots, actually. So it's slightly yellowy. Oh, God. These are really good pickles, by the way. And there's a bit of a funk to it as well. So we're going to turn it on, and then we're going to do something that's even more... I did sort of find out when we're looking at doing spectacles. So often when you're looking at spectacle, what people are really looking for is big reveals and explosions. We're commissioned with the Barbican once to open the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. I'll tell you when to start filming, by the way, so we've got a bit more chat, and then we'll go, so you don't use up too much memory. And we dyed the River Lee green using biocompatible dyes, and the whole river glowed in the dark. And had an audience of about 70,000 people. It's very, very, very magical. We used most of the stage lighting in London to be able to achieve this effect. It was very beautiful. Although someone did say on Twitter it looked like a PR stunt as incepted by Montgomery Burns. It's the early days of social media. But what we found out was that actually everyone was just like, yeah, this is cool, but where are the fireworks? So decided to give you the fireworks today. So, okay, we're going to turn... Oh, just turn this off, bugger. All right, we're going to turn this on, and if we could lower the lights a little bit. There we go.
Oh, my God. Oh, my Lord.
Oh, that's it. There's live spectacle. Thank you.
I have so many questions for you. But I guess in order to kind of bring all of these things together, which I think it is kind of rather obvious the amount of delight that we all still take from food being used in this manner. And so I thought that I would start us off before I turn over for a few questions, and then we are going to actually have to release Sam at a point in time because he's then going to make us a flavor cloud, which is going to be the last thing that we end on. But I do think that one of the phrases that was springing to mind as you all chatted away very eruditely here was, I don't know if you've heard of the term food porn. Okay, so, and this is a very aughts thing. This is an elder millennial problem that I have. And it was sort of before social media, but when one began to buy cookbooks because there were pretty pictures of food in it. I was living in Australia at the time, and there was a woman, Donna Hay, who had any number of cookbooks who came out, and she was not a chef, she was a food stylist. And I think that this is where these things began to kind of come through, but this idea that one could be creating spectacle at one's own dinner party. Now this leads us to two things. We can have delightful things, like the Gherkinator, of which I will never stop talking about now. But we also then kind of can tip over into the more unfortunate food for social media. And then even within that, there's also, I think that many people would be aware of the sort of food on social media as rage bait. You know, where people are like intentionally making the grossest thing you've ever seen in your life, which is sort of like the bad end of spectacle, right? But then it occurs to me that if you served me some medieval dishes now, I would be like, no, thank you, even if they are very beautiful, because our tastes have changed so much, because I don't particularly wish to eat cold shredded chicken that has been cooked in almond milk. Medieval people really want to eat cold shredded chicken that has been cooked in almond milk. You know, so there is something in here for all of us, I think, in terms of how tastes change, and this is kind of an ongoing process, even if we are kind of demanding spectacle. So I don't know. I guess that we going in order of time. Calum, what do you have to say about this?
I think it's, yes, as I say, as someone who is trying to recreate mock eggs out of almond cream in a kind of the delirium of COVID. Yes, I can definitely understand medieval dishes not being edible, and that there being more of a reverence for the look of the thing as it is about the taste. And also, I think that's a really interesting point about how tastes do change, because that's a running theme with a lot of recipes in medieval cookery books. There's a lot of spices, and I think they're designing recipes for a completely different palate, almost. You have like 7 or 8 different spices. It must have been like an explosion in your mouth, and not in a pleasant way. But yes, they don't seem to have the same issue with food tasting as good as it should, and also the sheer amount of food that they're producing. I always wondered about that. There's so many images of gluttony that's going around in the medieval period that people are seeing in sculpture, in manuscripts. Why are they not concerned with the amount of stuff that they are producing at these feasts? I think they counterbalance that with things like almsgiving, where they give a percentage of the feast is allocated at the start to the poor. But yeah, in general, they don't seem to be as worried about it.
And then, Ian, for you, like Calum, he's making these incredible spectacles, but I think now, if you served me a swan with chantilly cream in it, I would be delighted, and I would stop talking for the 5 minutes it would take me to inhale it. And so there is kind of something here where we're still, to an extent, kind of really beholden, I think, to this particular iteration of French cooking, where it's like, well, yes, that to me, yes, this is cuisine, And have we moved on very much from that, do you think?
So many questions at once.
Yeah, that's right.
No. Really applaud you for starting off with a panel of 4 men using porn as a metaphor for how we should address our relationship with this material. Okay. I think what is fascinating is the imaginative space that you can go to with food. And that actually is some of the joy of food history as well. As an actor, I've worked with directors who've, in the theatre, who've wanted to use period-specific perfume, for instance. Lovely idea for character and for audience. But other film directors I've worked with who also, first film I worked on was a Merchant Ivory film, and they were both very interested in food and would actually do period meals for us. As some idea of this is just another way imaginatively to access the possibility of, what a life might have been like. I mean, conversely, we can't completely know, actually. We've got ideas very often. We do have very specific recipes sometimes, but Elizabeth Davis is quite interesting on actually how it's very possible that, nutmeg in the Middle Ages might have tasted very different to the nutmeg that we used to know, this sort of thing. So I just mean we by discussing all of this, you go to that fun part in your head, actually, of an imagination around sensuality and taste and food. So to that extent, I think, Calum is interesting for that historically, but absolutely, to go back to your key point, of course, what he's doing is saying you can imagine this even though you will probably never experience it, which is some of what we do with food. And I think to that extent, it massively, predates Donna Haynes' sort of food porn of the 20th century. It's been there, at least since the publishing boom of the late 18th, early 19th century, of imagine this,
Well, and I suppose, Calum, you must be having rather a lot of sex in kitchens, because Calum did not. And that's it. But, I mean, so for you, when you're trying... it is my promise that I will sexually harass all my panel members while they're on there. But for you, when you are actually creating these things, there is a certain amount of over-the-topness that is going to bring people in. And, what is a clock pie, if not, like, one of the ultimate forms of presentation, right?
Yeah, I agree. I always try primarily to focus on the flavour first. The spectacle part comes secondary. Actually, a new book I've been researching here at the library is about regional pies of the UK, right? And very specific regional pies. And it's very interesting as you go through history. There's one pie we found, the fidget pie. Now, the sort of history of the fidget pie, where the name comes from, there's two ideas for that. It's a layered pie with lots of different ingredients inside. One is that when you cut it, the pie fidgets around. And the other is that in that area, the region it came from, fidget was also the name for a polecat. And polecat, and the idea was the pie smelt of a polecat as you were cooking it. So sometimes I embarked upon trying to capture it, and then I suddenly realised no one's going to want to buy this book, right? Loads of these recipes weren't actually very tasty back then. They were all about looking beautiful, and so actually the book has the history, has a drawing of the old recipe, and then my modern version of the recipe, because all the others were all mace, nutmeg, cured pork. So I think, we can do all these fantastical things, but I very much try and focus on flavour first.
and thank God for that. But, well, actually, I have to release you now, Sam, to make us a cloud, I think.
Just before we do that.
Yes, please.
There's been like a little bit of casting aspersion on just food for display. And I sort of wanted to defend it a little bit because it is in some ways quite sustainable in a really weird way. So just to give you an example of this, I've got within one of our meeting rooms a piece montée designed and built by Ivan Day, who's like the sort of brilliant, he's like the Indiana Jones of the historic pantry. If you don't follow historic food online, you should look at it. It's a real inspiration. But he originally built it for one of the sideboards of, in the style of Carême, one of the sideboards at Brighton Pavilion. And Brighton Pavilion had to get rid of it because they're going through all their collections and they're redoing their archives. And they're like, this is going to get some rats in it. We can't be attracting rats to nibble away at all those wonderful archives. So it ended up with us. And this thing is over 20 years old and it still looks sensational. And it's all made out of some pastillage sugar and blocks of wood. And it means that it's given pleasure just through sitting there to many people. So even though some of these special foods were inedible, they weren't necessarily used once. Because they could last for a very long time. So you could have something like that. Some of them would be used for 100 years, and they'd be just dusted off and brought out for the next occasion. Yeah. And you'd hope you have different guests. But at that point, I'll head off. Sorry.
No worries at all. So we have like very little time for questions because everyone has been so fantastic. But if anyone has a burning one for us while Sam makes us a cloud, I think that we have time for one or two. Up there? I think that we've got mics.
Oh.
I wanted to ask about this there's on the one hand where the end result is the spectacle, but there's the other thing that I think that wasn't so much discussed where the act of making is the spectacle. So I think of things like tableside service, that's like very 50s and 60s with crepe Suzette and steak Diane and Cherry's Jubilee and all of that. And I was wondering if there's just previous examples of that or if that's actually a very specific phenomenon of like 40 years in time.
There's an incredible restaurant in Paris, right? Johnnie Walker at the Plaza Athénée, where halfway through the dinner, this happens nowadays, halfway through the dinner, a curtain raises and pastry chefs are there pulling sugar. And that's something that actually used to happen all the time because sugar used to be an incredibly expensive ingredient. So that's something that's historically has happened and still happens nowadays, which is quite amazing.
I think from a medieval standpoint, very little tableside cooking happens.
Yeah.
Because the servants are in the kitchen, which is another place entirely away from where you can burn down the castle. Right?
It's a bit like the duck swimming gently on the water while feet are swimming furiously below. And I think also they quite like this almost magical experiment that suddenly this amazing creation just emerges out of nowhere rather than looking at the intricate workings of how it was done. And that's what you see in the cookbooks as well, where they don't really give that much instruction about how any of these amazing things were made. It's almost like a shorthand for the chefs.
What's interesting, because maybe this is one of these differences between the medieval, where there is this kind of anonymity to who things are making, and the difference of celebrity chefs like Calum.
Well, I was about to say, yes, it's absolutely part of Calum's story. He loved the idea when he was allowed to present at table, and the Rothschilds eventually, towards the end of his career, absolutely insisted on that because he was their celebrity chef. That was why people came to dinner, and why he ends up being friends with Rossini and Chopin and Victor Hugo, and a sort of a celebrity, an equal, not servant class in the same sort of way. But likewise, there was a habit of some sugar spinning and presentation of actually the idea of food as theatre, with occasionally Calum himself. Am I about to be upstaged by Sam again?
You are, yeah, absolutely.
Mate, really?
So I think we're still having to move things in very slowly.
Okay.
I think that's a really prescient question, though, because it does sort of underline what it is that we want. Because, you know, for medieval people, they want the spectacle without the idea of the work. Whereas now we're quite obsessed with the work, aren't we? And perhaps this is one of those moves towards the modern and moves towards the concept of celebrity.
I mean, I think that's why open kitchens became a big thing in the last 20 years. Is because people want to see things being made that they don't know how to do. That's why we made the front of the pie room glass, so you can come in and you watch the pie making happen. I don't necessarily want to see people, you know, cooking a spaghetti bolognese. I know how to do that. When I see, you know, somebody pulling at Chinese noodles, I want to stand there and watch that for 20 minutes. So.
There's it's kind of a scandal at the pavilion, Brighton Pavilion, because the Prince Regent actually dines with Calum in the kitchen, invites his guests in that sort of, you know, Gordon Ramsay's chef's table kind of thing. And the British press was scandalised that the heir to the throne should, you know, deign to hang out with servants, let alone a Frenchman, let alone Napoleon chef, all that kind of thing. But it's, although it should be said, before he ate in the kitchens, he had a red carpet laid throughout the kitchen. So he wasn't exactly slumming it with the staff, as it turns out. So.
And now I think it's Flavor Cloud time. Yeah? Yay!
First of all, I was going to ask you, Polly, and up to you, and maybe you, sir, to stand up, and because you're definitely in the danger zone. You're probably okay, I would say. And I'll move this out the way as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to combine some boiling water with liquid nitrogen, and then into the boiling water, we're going to put some of this, which is a whiskey distillery flavouring as well. So you're going to get the waft of actually stepping inside a whiskey distillery. And then a giant cloud will erupt. Thank you very, very much, guys, for moving. There is one bit of housekeeping as well. We've got everyone's attention. And again, this time I actually will tell people when to start filming. I apologise for kidding last time. I've noticed as well that, well, I was going to ask everyone, please, 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 could you pick up your popcorn and when you leave, take it out, and there should be a table outside and we can deposit all that. We are in the British Library, after all, so I want to leave it really, really nicely clean. And I'm going to start dosing in this whiskey flavouring that we're going to get a good waft of. It's quite a lot. Should smell really, really good. This is a flavouring. It's so it is hypoallergenic, halal, kosher, everything else. It's not. It won't intoxicate you, although we could do that. I'm then going to introduce everyone to Sarah. This is Sarah.
Hi,
Sarah's a physicist and filmmaker, and also let's give a really big round of applause. It's the first time she's done this.
Yay!
Okay. How are you feeling? Good, okay. Let's move into position. So we're going to come in here, and if you go over there, and I was going to ask you if you could take a video on my phone. That'd be really good. Sure. Thank you. And first of all, we're going to put all the liquid nitrogen in. So here we go. As liquid nitrogen goes in. A good old lot. Do you want a little bit more? Yeah. Okay, there we go. That's bloody loads. This smells really good, by the way.
It does, yeah.
And now, so if you pick up your urn, we're going to do a big countdown from 3. This also looks really good filmed in slow motion as well. Okay. And we're going to see what happens. It's going to be a suitably rip-roaring finale for a fantastic... Actually, can we get a massive round of applause to the panellists? I was taking that. That was fantastic.
Thank you very much.
And also to the British Library team, Polly, Brett, everyone else, thank you so much for a really good... And all of the audience here as well.
Okay.
Okay, now we're ready to go. We're going to count down from 3. Is everyone ready?
Yes.
Okay, 3, 2, 1, let's go! Oh my God. Oh my God. That's it.
Oh my gosh, it does smell.
Wow.
Oh my God.
I want a flavour cloud for every entrance or exit.
I think the listening through. I think that might have been the biggest one we've ever done. Thank you very, very much. Have a lovely rest of your day.
That's amazing. That is so cool.
I don't know. Can you see the stage? I don't know. Oh, that was, look, my cup overfloweth. That was the best. That I'm so glad I waited 7 years to do a spectacle event to get the perfect panel. Amazing conversation from Form of Curry, Catherine of Norwich, Carême, social media, Spirited Away, Calum's Crazy Pyramids, Sam, need I say more? Like, an amazing audience, fabulous discussion. Thank you so much, Eleanor, for steering us and this incredible panel, and to all of you for being here as part of the food season. Thank you so much.